If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, close your eyes for a moment and picture this. A shopping mall on a busy Saturday afternoon. Fluorescent lights stretching overhead. The smell of buttery popcorn drifting out of the movie theater lobby. Music spilling from the record store. Kids crowding around the arcade. And then, just beyond all of it, a sound that was impossible to ignore. A low electric hum. The sharp buzz of tiny motors running at full speed. The unmistakable smell of ozone, warm rubber, and hot electric motors filling the air. That was the world of slot car racing. For nearly 2 decades, it wasn't just a niche hobby, it was a nationwide phenomenon. Thousands of commercial raceways opened across America. Families packed into hobby shops. Kids saved their allowance for new cars and replacement parts. Competitive racers traveled from city to city. And at its peak, the industry generated millions of dollars, becoming one of the biggest hobbies in the country, bigger than some professional sports leagues. Then, almost as quickly as it had exploded in popularity, it disappeared from the mainstream. This is the story of how a simple hobby evolved from homemade basement tracks in local hobby shops into a full-blown cultural obsession. And how, despite its incredible success, the entire phenomenon came crashing down. The origin slot car racing didn't begin as a toy. Long before it became a childhood obsession, it started as a serious hobby for model builders and engineering enthusiasts. Back in the 1930s and 40s, model railroad hobbyists were constantly experimenting with new ways to bring miniature worlds to life. Instead of running tiny trains along tracks, some began wondering, what if miniature cars could be powered the same way? Using electric rails and guide slots, they built some of the earliest versions of what would eventually become slot cars. The concept remained a niche hobby for years, enjoyed mostly by dedicated tinkerers and hobby clubs. But by the late 1950s, British manufacturers had transformed the idea into a commercial product. Small electric cars raced around specially designed tracks, guided by a narrow slot while drawing power from metal rails beneath the surface. The cars were surprisingly fast, surprisingly realistic, and incredibly fun to race. It didn't take long for the idea to cross the Atlantic. American toy companies immediately recognized its potential. Brands like Aurora, Revel, and Strombecker saw far more than a hobby. They saw an entirely new market waiting to explode. What had been a specialized engineering pastime suddenly became a mass-market consumer product almost overnight. The timing couldn't have been better. The early 1960s were defined by America's obsession with speed, horsepower, muscle cars, NASCAR, Formula One, and the excitement of the space race. The future felt fast, and everything seemed to be moving at full throttle. Kids dreamed of driving high-performance cars long before they were old enough to get behind a real steering wheel. Slot cars offered the next best thing. On a kitchen table or a custom-built track, anyone could become a race car driver. With a handheld controller in one hand and lightning-fast reflexes in the other, players could push their tiny machines to the limit, battling friends lap after lap. As demand exploded, the hobby quickly outgrew living rooms. By the mid-1960s, dedicated slot car centers, known as commercial raceways, began appearing across the United States. Imagine a bowling alley, but instead of bowling lanes, the room was filled with enormous multi-lane racing tracks stretching across the floor. Customers could rent a car, pay for track time by the hour, and race complete strangers in high-speed competitions. These raceways became popular hangout spots where teenagers, families, and even adults gathered after school, on weekends, and late into the evening. In just a few short years, slot car racing had evolved from a niche workshop experiment into one of America's fastest-growing hobbies. And its biggest boom was still yet to come. The golden era. If the 1960s were slot racing's birth, then the mid-1970s through the early 1980s were unquestionably its golden age. Two companies stood above everyone else, Aurora and Tyco. Aurora's legendary AFX line quickly became the gold standard for performance. Their biggest innovation was something called magnetraction, small magnets built into the chassis that pulled the cars firmly onto the metal rails. Suddenly, racers could blast through corners at speeds that felt almost impossible without flying off the track. It made the cars faster, smoother, and far more exciting to drive. Tyco quickly responded with its own innovations and aggressive marketing. Soon, Aurora and Tyco became fierce rivals, with fans passionately arguing over which company made the faster cars. The marketing was everywhere. If you grew up watching Saturday morning cartoons, you probably remember the commercials. Bright neon tracks filled the screen. Cars rocketed through impossible curves, loop-the-loops, and dramatic jumps, while excited announcers promised the fastest racing experience you could have at home. Holiday shopping catalogs like the famous Sears Wish Book dedicated entire pages to elaborate slot car sets. And for countless kids, those colorful pages became the first draft of their Christmas wish list. But the real magic happened after the presents were opened. Slot car racing became part of family life. Fathers and sons, brothers, sisters, and neighborhood friends spent weekends designing tracks that grew bigger and more elaborate with every passing month. Extension cords stretched across basement floors. Sheets of plywood became permanent racing tables. Homemade banked corners, bridges, tunnels, and crossover sections transformed ordinary basements and garages into miniature race circuits. Some dedicated hobbyists built layouts so large that they occupied an entire room for years. And for many enthusiasts, owning the basic set was only the beginning. Just like real motorsports, the hobby became all about performance. Kids saved weeks of allowance, not necessarily for a brand new track, but for upgrades. Better tires for extra grip, hotter motors for more speed, lighter chassis for quicker acceleration. Every small modification promised an advantage on race day, and showing up with the fastest car became a source of real pride. Around the country, magazines covered the latest products, tuning tips, and racing techniques. Local hobby shops hosted races, clubs formed their own leagues, and informal championships brought together competitors eager to prove who had built the fastest machine. For nearly a decade, slot car racing wasn't some obscure hobby hidden away in specialist circles. It was everywhere. It was part of American family culture, part of weekend entertainment, and part of growing up for millions of kids. For a brief moment in time, slot cars weren't just popular. They were truly mainstream. The fall. So, what killed slot car racing? The short answer is simple: video games. But the real story is a little more complicated than that. For more than a decade, slot car racing had been one of the biggest attractions in shopping malls and neighborhood hobby centers. Commercial raceways were packed on weekends, and toy stores couldn't keep the newest sets on the shelves. It seemed like the hobby would keep growing forever. Then, almost without warning, something entirely new arrived. In 1978, Space Invaders exploded into arcades. Soon after came Asteroids, Galaxian, Defender, and then Pac-Man in 1980. These games captured people's attention in a way few entertainment products ever had. They were colorful, fast, constantly changing, and unlike anything most people had ever experienced. Arcade machines were cheaper to operate, took up far less space, and generated more consistent revenue. And perhaps most importantly, video games were the exciting new thing. Slot cars had been the symbol of modern technology throughout the 1960s and much of the 1970s. But suddenly, compared to glowing arcade cabinets with digital sound effects and animated graphics, They began to feel like yesterday's entertainment. Then came the biggest blow of all: home video game consoles. When the Atari 2600 exploded in popularity during the late 1970s and early 1980s, the arcade experience moved directly into people's living rooms. Families no longer had to drive to a shopping mall, rent a lane, or pay by the hour just to enjoy a competitive game. After buying the console, kids could simply turn on the television and start playing whenever they wanted. For many families, it was an easy choice. As more people stayed home to play video games, commercial slot car raceways began disappearing at an alarming rate. Throughout the early and mid-1980s, hundreds of raceways shut their doors. The spaces they left behind were converted into arcades, retail stores, restaurants, or entirely different businesses. Hobby shops that once displayed entire walls of Aurora and Tyco products gradually reduced their inventory, and many eventually stopped carrying slot cars altogether. At the same time, the original generation of slot car enthusiasts was growing up. The kids who had spent countless weekends racing in the 1970s became teenagers with new hobbies, part-time jobs, and different priorities. And because fewer children were being introduced to slot cars, there wasn't a large new generation ready to replace them. The hobby slowly lost its place in popular culture. By the mid to late 1980s, slot car racing had completed one of the fastest rises and one of the fastest declines of any major American hobby. What had once been a common sight in malls, toy stores, and family basements became something far more specialized. Although dedicated collectors and racers kept the hobby alive, slot car racing was no longer part of everyday childhood. By the late 1980s, it had become a niche hobby, remembered mainly by those who had lived through its golden years. It had become a niche hobby, remembered fondly by those who experienced its golden years, but largely forgotten by everyone else. The legacy. But here's the thing about hobbies like this. They don't actually die. They just go underground. Today, there's a dedicated and passionate collector's market. Vintage Aurora, AFX, and Tyco sets from this exact era regularly sell for real money among collectors chasing the nostalgia of their childhood. There's a whole ecosystem of specialty manufacturers still producing incredibly high-end slot cars for serious hobbyists. Some of it more technically advanced than anything from the 80s. And there's been a quiet resurgence tied directly to nostalgia. Adults who grew up with these tracks in their basements are the ones buying them now. Not for their kids necessarily, but for themselves. It's the same instinct driving vinyl records and retro gaming consoles back into popularity. Slot car racing never really lost its magic. It just lost its moment in the cultural spotlight, pushed out by a technology that offered something it couldn't. A screen you could plug in anywhere, anytime, without an extension cord across the basement floor. So if you had a slot car track growing up, or you spent your allowance at the mall raceway, let us know in the comments. What brand did you run? Aurora or Tyco? And if you like this trip back to the 80s, check out our two-part series on the top 10 80s TV shows only true Gen Xers remember. Links right up there. Subscribe if you want more of this. See you in the next one.